All right, welcome everybody. We're just going to allow a minute or so for folks to get logged in, and then we will get started. And while we're waiting for folks to get logged in, I will remind everybody that if you haven't already, be sure to visit the Frontiers website at frontiersctsi.org to check out upcoming events, and you can join Frontiers and access all the resources and information there. And one quick announcement before I let our speakers take it away. We have our next session slated, and it is on a special date. So I wanted to make sure everybody saves the date. On May 4th at noon, we'll have our next Research and Discovery Grand Rounds with Jenna Rogers from the University of Wisconsin in Madison on the science of effective mentorship. She's the research director at the Center for Improvement of Mentored Experiences at the Wisconsin Center for Educational Research, and a scientist with the National Research Mentoring Network Coordinating Center, which is part of the UW Research Mentoring Initiatives at the Institute for Clinical and Translational Research at UW-Madison. So that session is going to be really exciting, great speaker, but it is on a special date. So take note of that and add it to your calendars. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Jill.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity today to talk about community engagement at this Research and Discovery Grand Rounds. Dr. Ellerbeck and I talked about having a series on community engaged research. I'm Jill Peltzer. I'm an associate professor in the School of Nursing, and I'm on the Community Engagement Core Leadership Team with Andrea Bradley-Ewing, who I'm delighted to introduce today. Andrea is the Director of Community Engaged Research at Children's Mercy Kansas City. For more than a decade, she has garnered extensive experience conducting community engaged and community-based participatory research, including large intervention trials exploring the utility of behavioral counseling strategies to promote behavior change. She has collaborated with patients, families, healthcare providers, and faith and community-based organizations to address critical health issues, including HIV, diabetes, and heart disease that affect underrepresented and marginalized communities. More recently, Andrea has partnered with English and Spanish-speaking patients on PCORI-funded projects to develop resources around inappropriate antibiotic use among pediatric populations, has partnered with parents and community organizations in developing and refining interventions to increase vaccination uptake among adolescents in the African-American faith communities, and most recently with a community partner has received a PCORI grant on autism. Andrea is a member of our Frontiers Community Engagement Leadership Team, and I'm delighted to turn it over to you, Andrea.
All right, thank you, Jill. It's one of those moments where you get introduced and you're like, okay, wait a minute, who is she talking about again? And it's you. Well, I am so delighted to be here. So thanks for the invitation, Jill, and thank you all for being a part of this presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about community engaged research, and I'm going to share my screen. So I won't be able to see, I don't think I'll be able to see faces very much. If you have a question or comment, feel free to use the chat. I believe Jill and Ashley will be monitoring that chat. And if you have questions, just feel free to interrupt me during the presentation. Before I get started, can you all just give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen, or just give me the okay? Awesome. All right. Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about community engaged research. I'm going to just provide an overview of what it is, what are some of the benefits and the challenges of engaging communities in the research process, and then provide an overview of community engagement at the CMRI. And I'm so delighted. I see some of the members from the Community Advisory Board at Children's Mercy Research Institute are on the call and joining the meeting. So just really delighted for them to be a part of this, because I don't do the work that I do without awesome members of the community and patients and families who work alongside me. And then we're going to highlight some of the projects that we have worked on as a collaborative body. And so these are going to include things like NIH projects, PCORI projects, and we're going to share the highs and the lows, the wins and the losses. So for all of us who are a part of the research world, we all know that it is not always delightful. We don't always get the great feedback from reviewers that we want. And that's also a part of engaging with communities, in that full spectrum of the research process, the highs and the lows. All right. So I'm going to start with just an overview of community. So when we think about community, we think about just a group of people who have similar affiliations, whether it's geographic proximity, urban, suburban, rural, maybe it's culture or language or shared experience. Maybe it's parents of children with rare diseases who have kind of navigated sort of the complicated rare disease healthcare space together. Or maybe they're people who have similar interests or values. So maybe it's a group of clergy that are interested in addressing some of the health disparities or health issues they're seeing in their community and in their congregations. So when we think about community and we think about research and we think about the way research has traditionally been done in a lot of our environments, community engagement is a way that we actually do research in a very collaborative manner. So one of the key principles of community engaged research is that it's collaborative in nature. It is not a researcher or a principal investigator saying, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. It is a reciprocal relationship, a collaborative relationship where both investigators and community members are working together and learning from each other at every phase of the process. Community engaged research is also equitable. It's equitable in terms of how we use our time, how we use our resources, and also how we ensure that everyone's valued and respected. And so we'll touch on things about like payments. How do we work together with community partners when we have, maybe sometimes we have finite resources, or maybe it's before a grant is funded. How do we make sure that that partnership is equitable and not one person or one group is leading and making all of the decisions for that group? Community engaged research is also centered on community priorities. It's really engaging communities in understanding what are the issues that are important to them and how can we leverage the expertise from healthcare providers and from researchers to really address some of these complex issues. It's not always researcher driven or funder driven. A lot of times in community engaged research, we will kind of go and navigate in spaces where we didn't really see ourselves, but it's a need that was brought to our team by the community. And so in an effort to be responsive to that, we do so. It also recognizes the strengths that each member of the team brings to the table. And, you know, I will just say that we all have unique perspectives and experiences, and we're all experts in something. And this is something just to really kind of keep in mind when engaging communities. It can be easy to think researchers or healthcare providers are the experts, but patients and families are the experts. Even our teens, we really let them know that they are the experts in how to effectively communicate with their peers of what their lived experience is. And many times we don't have that same level of expertise in those areas. Community engagement also includes combining knowledge and action. So how are we taking the expertise that our researchers and our parents and patients have and actually moving that forward to really address the needs and the priorities of our patient and our broader community? And when we think about engagement, a lot of times, I always have this motto that some engagement is better than none. But a lot of times we think of engagement early on in the research process, and then we don't do that anymore. But when we really think about true engagement, it really happens at every phase of the research process. So from the development of the idea or the research question to dissemination of the outcomes of that research, there is a space and an opportunity for community engagement at each of those phases. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And the ultimate goal of engaging communities is it really leads to high quality community-centered research. And as some of you have seen, if you've applied for grants recently, whether it's NIH or PCORI, you will see increasingly that funders are requiring or strongly recommending some engagement from a community voice or a patient voice in those efforts. And there's some reasons to that. And so when we think about sort of the different phases of the research process and how you can think about engaging communities in those different areas. Of course, in developing the research objective, a lot of times, our research is driven by our own interest or our own expertise, or maybe it's the funder that is requiring or recommending that we study a certain topic. In community engagement, it's really looking at what are the locally relevant issues, or what are the issues that are affecting your patient population. And I'll just give you one example. So recently in one of our teen advisory board meetings, a researcher came to our group and was developing a study around vaping cessation intervention in an inpatient pediatric setting. And one of the things that quickly came to the surface during that conversation with our teens was the need to really explore mental health. One of the things that they mentioned was all teens know that vaping is not healthy and it's not good for you. But if we're not really getting at the core issue and the root issue of why teens are vaping in the beginning, then we may not have as much of an impact as we want. And so for this researcher, again, the study was primarily focused on vaping cessation. And then quickly, it sort of started to incorporate looking at mental health, looking at some of the reasons that teens begin to vape initially. There's also opportunities for engagement with data collection. We've worked on projects, particularly in church settings or community settings, where we have actually had members of the community trained. They've completed city training or other approved training, so they're able to go out into the community and collect data. And one of the reasons for that is sometimes if you are an investigator and you don't have that built-in trust with the community, it can be very difficult to ask, to go in and ask very sensitive questions, whether it's sexual identity or number of sexual partners or past drug use. And so sometimes people are more comfortable interacting with someone that they know and trust. And so that's another way that community members can be engaged in that process. And then dissemination is another key way that community members can be engaged. Again, making sure that there is a way and a mechanism built into your project so that you're not just focused on academic publications, but that you're really looking at what are some of the community venues, what are some of the places that patients and caregivers and community members are where you could actually disseminate this information. And sometimes we are not the experts into where those places are or where those communities exist. And that's why it's another great opportunity to engage communities in that dissemination effort. And so when we talk about community engagement, I just to get a sense, if you've never heard of community engagement or never engaged communities in any of your work before, and this seems very scary to you, just I guess you could give a thumbs up. And I will say, you're not alone. For a lot of investigators, and I would say a lot of um, investigators who are very uncomfortable or maybe have never worked or partnered with communities, it can seem very daunting. And again, I always say some engagement is better than none. And so there is a continuum. There are ways that you can engage. And so I would recommend, if you've never engaged with community before, maybe that first step is outreach. So kind of thinking about your work, how can you start to connect with communities to provide information or education about some of the work that you're doing, or about some of the health disparities or issues that you're noticing in the community. What that does is that helps to establish those communication channels. And so when we look at the really true, very strong levels of engagement, we have to understand that those relationships aren't built overnight. And so you have to start somewhere. And usually you start with that outreach, or that sort of getting to know you phase. And then consulting, that's sort of more engagement. And that's where you start to have bidirectional communication. So you're not just providing information, but you're hearing and you're learning from the community, and you're trying to seek answers. What that does is really kind of helps, again, develop those connections. Involvement would be the next step. So that's, again, participatory communication. It's better engagement, and there's increased cooperation and visibility. So what's happening here is that the community is starting to think, okay, well, this investigator isn't just coming around when they want to collect data for their study, but they're really investing time, and they're really beginning to show a commitment towards this relationship. And then you move to collaboration, which I would say is really good, on the engagement continuum. That's when you have community involvement, you have bidirectional communication, you have partnership in all aspects of a project. And that's where you see that trust being built, where the community trusts you. And sometimes it can take years to go from that outreach space to that collaboration space, because it takes just that much time for some communities to show trust. And then finally, when you're at the shared leadership phase, that's where you have that strong bidirectional relationship, where that final decision making is happening at the community level, and you have strong trust. And that's where you get to those points where you're actually co-writing grant applications, that maybe you're a co-I on a grant and your community partner is the PI. You have established trust and a relationship. And I'm going to highlight one project where we've actually moved through this continuum, and this process has taken like 7 to 8 years. And so it is an investment of time. It is an investment of resources. So why is this important? I mean, there's so many things. Most of us are very busy, and there's so many other things that we could be doing. Why should we take the time to really engage communities in our work? Well, one of the things that we know is that traditional research isn't enough. And when we think about what makes up a healthy child or a healthy person, only 20% of what we do in our healthcare setting actually contributes to their overall health. And so if we think about that, if we're only conducting studies in our traditional settings, in our very controlled environment, how are we really impacting all of these other areas of life that really contribute to health? How are we addressing socioeconomic factors or health behaviors that happen outside of our practice or outside of our clinics? And how are we affecting or addressing issues in the environment? And so really, if we want to I don't think any of us came into this line of work because we wanted to be famous, or we wanted the prestige. We really do this because we want to make a difference in the lives of our patients and families and children in our community. And so if we want to respond to those complex social factors, we really have to have a better understanding of what those are. And we don't have all the answers, and we have to really partner with our community. The other thing that we know is that recruitment of diverse communities in clinical trials is lacking. That is a problem that's been reported for several decades now. And again, there is in the scientific community a long legacy of mistrust and some valid reasons why that trust wouldn't be there. And so if we have kind of dug ourselves in a hole, we really have to take the time to kind of find ourselves back. It also helps to promote widespread uptake of interventions. Again, if we're only doing interventions in a very controlled clinical setting, it really reduces the likelihood that a patient or family can actually go outside into their community, into their home, into the place where they worship or they go to school and actually implement that similar intervention. And again, responding to stakeholder and funder priorities. More and more research funders are requesting and requiring engagement from the community in your work. This was recently, this is an infographic that was recently published in a recent article in PLOS One, and it really just takes into account all of the barriers to participating in a clinical trial. And so when we think about if we have a clinical trial within our institution, and we think about all of the things that we ask patients and families to overcome just to get to us, just to have an opportunity to participate in a clinical trial that they may or may not have some direct benefit from, we are asking them to sometimes take off of work, to find transportation to our institution, for parents at our institution with multiple children. Sometimes it's picking those other children up or finding a babysitter for those other children so they can come to our clinic. It's asking them to speak a language that many don't understand. And so then it's that introducing an interpreter into the healthcare system, or it's just asking, we're communicating often with patients and families that speak English, but it's in very scientific language that's full of medical jargon that the average, family just doesn't comprehend. We're also asking our patients to really overcome a lot of institutional and structural barriers. And when we think about, and those who are native to the Kansas City area, when you think about the location of some of our premier healthcare institutions, it is by design that many of them are not east of Troost. And so there's all of those barriers. And then there's also the lack of coordination, of care, lack of diversity. So there's so many barriers that these families have to come through. And some of the ways, and here's the thing that I've realized is that as researchers and as part of a research team, a lot of time we don't even think about those barriers. I gave a presentation several months ago, and I asked a group of clinical trial coordinators to describe their ideal research participant. And when they described the ideal research participant, some of the terms that were used were flexible. We're able to come to appointments, able to come to multiple appointments, easy to contact. So if they had a working phone, they could be contacted via email. We had multiple ways to reach out to them, that they were going to be on time, that they were going to be timely. And so you think about all of those descriptors that go into your ideal candidate for a research study. And a lot of our patients and families who have some of these barriers wouldn't kind of fall into that category. So taking research outside of our institution really helps to overcome some of those barriers. And what it does is it really combines our research knowledge, our scientific assessment with the lived experience from the community. They can really tell us when we're designing a study whether or not it's feasible. And really kind of challenge us to think about how are we going to engage maybe patients and families with mobility issues, or maybe those who are visually impaired, and really kind of challenge us to kind of think of ways that we can expand our research to be more inclusive and more community-centered. And what that leads to is really improved science and increased community capacity. So when we think about the community, this is one question that I'll always ask when researchers come to the community advisory board, or when they're consulting with me about how to engage community. One of the things I always ask is, what's in it for the community member? What's in it for the patient and family? It's great that you're going to get that grant funded, and it's great that you're going to get your paper published, but let's not forget about their needs and priorities. And so one of the things that I think community engagement really allows us to do is to make sure that we are centering our work as much as possible on the priorities of families and communities, and that we're able to share information about new discoveries or treatments that could benefit them directly. It also provides an opportunity for collaboration and shared resources and recognition. So one of the things that we are very passionate about is really providing opportunities to include community members on publications and manuscripts in the grant writing process. And so while sometimes it's easy for researchers to think, well, I don't know that my community member wants to write a manuscript. What we learned is you never know what direction in life someone is going to take. And one example of that, we were, as part of a study that Jill had mentioned previously in the introduction, on our study engaging parents in really shared decision making about antibiotic use. As a part of that project, we had a member of our project team who was a parent research associate, who was a stay-at-home mom at that time. But then since that project has decided to go to PA school. And guess what was included on that application to PA school? A manuscript that she helped to write, and that was published. And so when really thinking about how do you share the recognition, how do you share the resources, really think about being as equitable as possible and having those conversations up front. Now, I've made community engaged research sound awesome and amazing, and I'm a realist, so I know that it is not without its challenges. Some of the challenges are relevance. Sometimes, we might have issues that are brought to us by the community, and we may not have the expertise or know of anyone who has the expertise to really effectively address that issue. So, how relevant or how close can we align our work with that of the community? We also know that in some communities, there's a lack of trust. There's limited training for community members as well as researchers. One of the things that we are really not trained on is how to engage with communities. Part of my role as the director of community engaged research, before research teams come and present to the community advisory board, I often sit with them and go through their slides or their presentation and really have to tweak it and alter it so that it is appropriate for a community audience. And it's been refreshing to see how difficult that process is for some researchers, because it's like, oh, wait a second, I literally have to unpack everything that I'm accustomed to doing and really relearn how to communicate. And so one of my best lines is, when you're presenting to our youth research advisory board, I want you to think about, how would you share your work with your nephew at Thanksgiving dinner? And that's the way that you need to approach communication with teens or with family members. Um, I've already talked about building partnership takes time, so that's another barrier. There's also the academic status quo. I know that, and I recognize that for many of you, um, there is no, secure time to really focus on that, on community engagement. How do you show that in your CV? How does that incorporate into, your applications for tenure or promotion? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And what do you do when you invested time and you submitted a grant and it isn't funded? And so really kind of thinking about how to change the way we value engagement work as an institution. We also know that everyone's busy. There's competing demands, and there's expectations for dissemination of results in academic journals. So oftentimes our time and our energy is spent on kind of what is rewarding or what's necessary for our career growth, because community engagement isn't as valued or recognized within our existing academic structures. So one of the ways that as an institution, Children's Mercy has really tried to kind of address some of those barriers and challenges that investigators often have with engaging communities is through the development of a community advisory board and a youth research advisory board. And this is a group of our community advisory board is a group of adults. Some of our members are on the call today. Hey, Bruce. Hey, Jessica. And we meet monthly, and they meet with investigators who are interested, or maybe they have a question about their project. And the initial interaction is sort of that kind of a rapid reactor, kind of the researcher comes, shares their proposed research study, and then they get immediate feedback from the community advisory board. And some of the things that we often encourage as well is after that initial presentation with the CAB, that there are several CAB members who will work alongside with a researcher as part of that research team to write the grant, to begin really refining their recruitment materials or their dissemination plan, because we recognize a lot of those things can't happen within a 1 hour per month meeting with our CAB. So we do encourage ongoing collaboration. We also have a youth research advisory board, and this is a group of teens who provide input on all research that is related to youth or teens in our institution. And the Youth Research Advisory Board was actually, this is a pilot program. This was actually a project that was funded through one of the pilot awards through Frontiers. And this Youth Research Advisory Board is set to end in June, but we had, oh my goodness, such an overwhelming response from teens in our community, so much so that we had space for 15 teens to serve on this board. And we've had several teens who are part of an ad hoc group. And so what that means is basically they've said, if you have a researcher who's doing a study that aligns with my interest or my future career goal, I'd love to be a part of that. I'd love to work with them. And so there's been a huge overwhelming response. We want to continue this because we do not want to tell these amazing teens who really kind of transformed the way a lot of our researchers do their work that this is the end, no more. So we are currently looking for ways to continue this effort, but they have been a great group to work with. And really, they are supporting the mission of CMRI, but really helping to advance research within our area, within our region. And I will say that the Youth Research Advisory Board sort of monthly rapid reactor is open to all Frontiers partnering institutions. So if you are a researcher from KU or St. Luke's or UMKC and you're doing a study that engages teens, we think it's best to get teen feedback, because we have recognized that some of the policies or some of the ways that we traditionally communicate to research participants is not the way that teens receive messaging or communication. And so they have been really, really great and insightful. We just want to create a collaborative relationship here at the CMRI so that researchers, patients, families, community members can really have support so that they're able to work together, that they're able to build relationships, to build trust that really last beyond one project period and is really sustainable. We also encourage collaboration on everything from, again, identifying research methods or effective recruitment methods. How do we interpret data, or maybe what are some of the reasons or some of the things that we may not be seeing that members from our community advisory board might see. And also identifying and addressing some of the barriers to research participation. So within the past a few years, some of the things that we've learned from families is our traditional ways of paying research participants for participating in research were not great, that they were very restrictive with respect to requiring, at times we would we used to require a collection of a social security number just to complete a survey. And as you can imagine, for some families, that was very off-putting, and that would be sometimes the reason why a family would decide not to participate in a research study, or there was fear or concerns if it was in a family where maybe one or more people was undocumented, that there again created that fear and that sort of really that lack of trust or that mistrust of what is the research process. So for researchers who want to present to the CMRI CAB or the YRAB, we ask that they complete a review request. And so this is a proposal review request that is a REDCap form. It gets uploaded, our community engaged research team takes a look at it, and we share it with our board chair and co-chair, who are parents on the CAB. And they really look at it as whether or not the researcher has completed community engaged research training, whether or not the project kind of aligns with some of the interests from some of the board members who are currently on the board. How is the project really responsive to community or patient priorities? How long is the board going to be engaged? How are they planning to share the results with the board? And then also, is there a plan for board stipends? So one of the things that we ask researchers is that as an institution, we support the community advisory board, but any collaborative activities that happen outside of that board, we ask the researcher to really budget for that, to really include that line item in their budget. Because if we are all valued for our time and effort in conducting research or developing research proposals, we want the community to be valued in that same way. So now I'm going to just share some of the projects that our team has worked on, and feel free if any of the parents on the CAB want to chime in and share their experience on any of this work, feel free to do so. But the first one, this was an R01 grant that was submitted, and it was focused on addressing social determinants of health in child obesity treatment with community health workers. And as part of this project, Mariah Kranz, who's not on the call, is a member of the Community Advisory Board, and is also directs the community health worker team at Community Health Council of Wyandotte County. And she was, the researcher came to our board, presented, asked if there were members who wanted to be a part of this project. Mariah volunteered, and then Bruce also was a part of this project. So this actually started back in 2021, and that was the first time that Dr. LaRoche had presented to our team. And later, the following month, there was a grant development team that began to meet weekly, and that included some of the members from the Community Advisory Board. In February, so it was a pretty quick turnaround. If any of you have worked on an R01, we did not have a ton of time to get that submitted. So the grant was submitted, again, more than 120 pages, lots of edits and feedback and meetings and markups, on different versions of the document. And then we had some issues with getting a right study section assigned. So between February and April, we were getting bounced around from one study section to the other. And so finally, the third time was the charm. So the third study section reviewed the proposal, scored it, thought it was good, but had some concerns about the feasibility in terms of whether or not, we would be able to recruit the population or the numbers that we had included in the grant. And so in June, we got the notification that the grant wasn't funded. So more than almost like 8 months of time, effort, and energy going into this process for it to not be funded. So I'm going to break, and I just want to invite Bruce if you want to. And Bruce was one of the CAB members who was a part of this process, and just love to hear your thoughts about sort of being involved from this aspect.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. Hope everybody can hear me. Andrea, can you hear me? Can you give me a thumb? Okay, perfect. Yes, I was part of that October 2021 group. I expressed my interest in that. I'd just been on the board for a few months. It hadn't been established very long. And Dr. LaRoche interviewed me and about my background, what she was trying to accomplish with the study. And at the end of the meeting, she said, well, I'd like you to be part of the team if you're interested, but there's a book you have to read first. I'd gone through all the city training and everything, and it's called Scarcity. And said, after you read that book, then you come back and tell me if you're still interested. And I was like, well, what's this all about? Well, it opened my eyes to a lot of things. But I said, I'm all in. Part of the team that met weekly. Andrea gave me a couple more books to read, so I wasn't quite as naive. But we worked hard, and I was so naive when you looked at the team that was put together with Dr. LaRoche, Dr. Hampel, then you look at the KU people who are co-investigators, Dr. Davis, Dr. Martin, Andrea with all of her experience on this. It was like, this is a no-brainer. I mean, this is like, this is the all-star team. And everybody said, no, this is a long, tough process. And but it was interesting. And then other people on the cab, like Dr. Daniels and Andrea having conversations about, certain segments are actually over-recruited, because to get enough community engagement, sometimes you just end up with the same people getting talked to about different studies, because you think that there's a huge, between Children's Mercy and KU, there has to be this huge population, and how can recruitment and retention be a problem? But the reality is that there is, and sometimes there's only a few people that everybody keeps going back to the same time, and it's a huge drain on their time and resources. And going back to the same churches, for example, are they, how do you expand that? So it was fascinating for me. I primarily was, what I would discuss is somewhat of a liaison back to the team from the cab, and then also really an editor of trying to make sure that we had all these concerns addressed. I have to say, I was CEO of a company, worked on huge deals for a long time, and had a lot of those that didn't happen either. But I told Andrea when we got the news, I said, I've probably never been more disappointed in my life not to have the study funded. And, it was so important. And we're going to keep plugging away, right, Andrea and Dr.
That's
LaRoche,
right.
and we're going to figure out something. But so that's kind of it pretty quickly, but great learning experience. And I do believe that the CAB and its resources did bring value to the team, and long term, I think that this is a great thing. I will say one thing. We had one outside of this study that there was some teenagers who had done a lot of work under, and Andrea had mentored them, and they came and gave one of the most impressive presentations I have ever seen. These two 17-year-old women were unbelievable, passionate, and they knew what their career path was, but the opportunity that they were given as through Andrea and the cab was just amazing. And there's some really incredible young people out there, and this teenage board is really important, I think, to our future.
I agree. Thank you so much, Bruce, for sharing that. And thank you so much for hanging in there with us and being committed and dedicated to sort of starting this whole process again. And it just kind of goes to show with community engagement, it's important to kind of share those low points, because you are going to be disappointed, and it is a part of the process. And Bruce and I were on the phone, and we talked for about half an hour, and it was like, sometimes you get those reviews back, and you just need like a week to process, and then you have to kind of jump back into it. And so I'm just amazed and pleased and overwhelmed and thankful that we get to do this great work together and be a part of this broader effort. One of the other projects I wanted to highlight, so this is kind of on the other spectrum. So this was a project that was just recently funded from PCORI, and it's focused on addressing disparities among youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so this is a project that really kind of started more than 8 years ago with one of the members of our board, Kim Riley, who has interest in really kind of understanding disparities, especially related to transition of care for African American and Hispanic children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And she originally was a member of a community advisory board very many years ago for a different project, where we were really kind of trying to understand vaccine hesitancy. And one of the reasons that we really thought it was important to engage families with maybe a child who had autism, or because of that concern that's often linked to vaccines and autism risk. And so that kind of started, that project led to a pipeline to proposal award through PCORI, and then it led to external funding to really kind of explore what are some interventions to increase HPV vaccination uptake among adolescents. But throughout all of that engagement on these vaccine-related projects, it was never lost on me that her real passion was really focusing on transition and health outcomes for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so we stayed in contact all this time and continued to meet, continued to brainstorm. And then this opportunity kind of came, and Kim said, you know what, we need to do something about this. And so this was a project and a grant that really came out of her priorities and what she was really passionate about. So much so that she started a nonprofit that's really focused on transition outcomes for African American youth with disabilities. But then we submitted a PCORI grant, and this was the first time that we submitted this grant. It was not recommended for funding, but the second time it was. And so for the last 2 years, we've been working on submitting, getting a group together to really work on this grant proposal. And what we're planning to do here is really develop a comprehensive research agenda focused on addressing disparities within this population, and really looking at issues like access to care, time to diagnosis, and transition support from the pediatric health space to the adult health space for many of these children. We also just received an Increasing Diversity in Pediatric Cancer award that's really focused on really kind of looking at some of those barriers to engagement in pediatric cancer research, and really as an institution implementing some of those solutions. And some of those solutions require dollars. Maybe it's as an institution, in addition to community advisory board, how do we provide transportation support so that folks who are engaged in research that has to take place in a clinic, because maybe it's cancer related, we're doing blood draws, or we're doing medical procedures, but we want to make sure that transportation isn't a barrier, that cost isn't a barrier, that time off work isn't a barrier, and that we can provide support and resources to overcome some of those. We're also testing a DEI research toolkit and developing comprehensive strategies so that as an institution, we are able to track and monitor how we're doing in terms of engagement of diverse populations in research across our institution. So as we wrap up, I want to just leave plenty of time for questions at the end. Just kind of, thinking about, how do I engage communities in research? What are some of the best practices that I need to keep up, that I need to keep in mind? One of those is show up early and as often as invited. You don't want to overwhelm your community with your presence, but you want to be present before you have anything to ask. So that they know that that relationship is genuine. Also allow time, because building that relationship, building that trust is going to require time. Negotiate goals, processes, and outcomes very early. We have, with our community advisory board and our youth research advisory board, we have a board charter that was developed by our board members, and it includes things of like how they'd like to be governed, how do they want a chair, do they want a board chair, what stipend amount is fair and reasonable for our community advisory board members. We also discuss budget considerations. We establish preferred modes of communication. We prioritize our partners' convenience rather than our own. So when our team said, you know what, we kind of need our own space, our community advisory board meets Tuesdays at noon, but our youth research advisory board said, you know what, we want to meet Tuesdays at 7 p.m. So guess what? At 7 o'clock, 7 to 8 o'clock, we're meeting with our youth research advisory board because that's what they told us works for them. We discuss ownership of data, products, and processes of dissemination. We co-write grant applications, as Bruce alluded to, and we just really commit to transparency and reciprocity through all phases. And one of the ways that we keep track of that is we do biannual evaluations with our YRAB and our CAB, and we really want to just have open discussions of what's going well, what isn't, and opportunities for improvement so that we can kind of tackle any problems or issues that come up as they come up. All right, well, thank you all so much for your time, and I'm going to stop sharing and have any questions.
It looks like Phil has a question.
Do you want us to just shout them out, Jill?
Yeah.
So Andrea, thank you. That was wonderful. Appreciate all the thoughts you've given us. And also thank you, Bruce, for sticking out that grant application process. I think I mentioned in the chat, I think one of the big benefits of community engaged research and the process is how it is helping our community members appreciate the challenges of what we do. And I don't mean to belittle the community engaged parts of research, but I'm just saying is there is a bidirectional benefit to all of this activity. And so I'm wanting to be a little bit provocative now to you, Andrea, and I'm going to say something like, I feel like community engaged research is just research, but I don't mean that to belittle it. I mean that to say it should be the standard. And the message that I didn't think quite came through in your presentation today was that this is where we should be starting. And so the wonderful tools that you've told us about and the techniques and the strategies should be getting us to everybody thinking in this way. And I guess one other point I would add is you said earlier on that when people are writing their grant applications and the funding agency is telling them that they have to do community engaged research, and so you've got to come up with some, I'm sure in many cases, lame efforts at engaging the community, however anyone wants to define that. But the reality is, I think the real entity who we should be responding to is the community members. Right? They are the consumer here. For one, they're the taxpayers who pay the money that we get from NIH or PCORI. but they are the ultimate user and beneficiary of whatever it is that we are developing, whether it's drugs, devices, behavioral interventions. And so I think as we have this conversation, we really need to keep that in mind and frame it in some more powerful ways, so that investigators who are still lagging can get the message that if you're going to do good research, right? And do it right, and take the pain at the beginning to build it up. So anyway, that's sort of my rant.
No, I completely agree. I think community engaged research should be the standard way that we do research. There should be, if it were up to me, we would just do away with that traditional, research model, and everything would be community engaged research. But I do think, just one of the challenges is, again, not only getting researchers on board, because sometimes we have a lot of researchers who want to do community engagement, but then it's, how do I leverage community engagement with my clinical responsibilities, or, with my other responsibilities? So I think it's really having the interest and the desire from the researchers, but really kind of how do we look at institutional structures so that we're able to value that work? That's the second piece. Jill?
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think that we value, a lot of us, and I think those of us on this call value community engaged research. We know how critical it is, but academia is not set up for community engaged research. As Andrea talked about and shared examples, it takes a lot of time to build those relationships. It is being reciprocal and not only asking from the community, but giving to the community. And our promotion and tenure guidelines don't really support that. It's, where are you publishing? You need to publish in high impact journals that often, like in nursing, don't even reach the practicing nurses, let alone reach the community that we want the results to go to. So I think institutions have to really look at how we are valuing community engagement. What kind of support are we providing through indirects for, providing compensation to community partners as we're working on an NIH grant and we're meeting weekly, or, we are establishing community advisory boards. So I just think that at an institutional level, we have work to do to support researchers in doing good community engaged research.
Okay, Kim.
I agree with what you said, and Andrea and Jill. We would need a huge culture shift at the academic medical center for community engaged research to be the standard. I would love that. And I am not a researcher, but I work with a lot of researchers, and I work as a liaison with the community and move projects forward. And I can't tell you how many times just little things like the researchers will be like, well, can't they just come to my office? Why do I have to go down there? Just simple stuff like that, which you would think would be a no-brainer. I just feel like it's a big culture shift that needs to happen. We have a lot of work to do internally in order to make that a priority, which I agree it totally should be a priority.
Yes.
Perfect. And Kim, I responded. I saw your question in the chat, and I'll just, yes, the team members are paid the same as the adults. We did not want, because they really are providing the same level of input and engagement in research. So we didn't want to say that they're less valuable because they're 17. And we recommend, we kind of looked at, the different members of a research team and what are kind of the salaries. It's not a perfect, it's not an exact science, but we just kind of going forward, we have a recommendation of $50 an hour for a consultation with a member of the community advisory board or the teen advisory board. And we came to that number because when we look at clinical trial coordinators, and when we look at the PI or the co-Is on a project team, what is something that if you average those out, what would you kind of get to for a community advisor? And that's the number that we came to. And we ask you know, our members, we kind of check periodically to see, is that still reasonable? Is that fair? Does that sound right? And if we need to adjust, we'll definitely address that at that time.
Well, it looks like we're at 1 o'clock. I just wanted to mention really quickly, Andrea was talking about opportunities for engaging. This is 2 different opportunities that are looking at increasing diversity in clinical research. One is an upcoming workshop on inclusive participation in clinical research. It's March 30th and 31st. And then Vanderbilt has a Faster Together, Enhancing Recruitment of Minorities in Clinical Trials. It's like a 4-week, if you want to pace it out for 4-week, program on different strategies to increase diversity in clinical trials, and that they're both free.
And I just included the link in the chat. So if anybody on this call wants to set up a consultation with the Youth Research Advisory Board, that link is included in the chat. And I will share that with, I'll share that with you, Jill, as well, if you
Sure.
want to share that out after today's meeting.
Sure.
All right, well, that's our time for today. Thanks everybody for attending, and thank you so much to our panel. You all shared some great information today. I totally didn't even realize it was 1 o'clock. I was so into the talk that was going on. So thank you again, everybody, for your time, and save the date for the next Research and Discovery Grand Rounds, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.